welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, program number 4 in our series on the Gospel of Mark. Mark. I love this gospel. I keep saying over and over again, but I really do. It's such a pleasure to teach and to preach this gospel. We have the succinct story. I suppose if someone were writing a script and they would follow and do a job sort of like what Mark did. A lot of visual, not that many words. And so it's a joy and a pleasure, especially after spending nearly a year doing the book of Revelation, I got to say, to be able to do this gospel. We never can get too far away from reading the story of Jesus. So here we are. We're still in Mark, the first chapter, and we're going to look at just one story this time. It's called Jesus Calls the First Disciples, and that is chapter 1, verses 16 through 20. Now, I want to, before I get into the verses, I want to have a little discussion of the idea of call, kaleo in Greek. What that means, call. We're going to see it a little bit, but the word is rich in meaning in our New Testament. And I want to just talk about it a little bit because it is the core of what we would call a Reformed theology or the doctrine of election. Now, most of you know that I am Reformed in theology. And I didn't come by that easily. Only in 1995, for the 29 years of my ministry, I didn't understand anything about it. In fact, I rejected it. And I think it was because I didn't understand. There we got it on the screen, kaleo. I guess I pronounced it right. When I was in seminary a long time ago, we translated Greek one way, and then they went and pulled a switcheroo on us, and they started using modern Greek pronunciation. Oh well, I'm old school, as everybody knows. But so here we have this little transition I went through, and I thought it was a bigger deal than actually it turned out to be. It's really quite simple. Really quite normative, and so much of it is encapsulated in the word call. So this story is Jesus calls the first disciples. Now you might put it this way. They didn't come up to him and volunteer service. He didn't put an ad in the paper. Say, we're looking for a few guys who are looking to lead a very difficult life and finally be killed by people who hate you. And we're going to be meeting over here under the fig tree tomorrow at noon. Everybody come along and sign up. Well, if you knew what was actually coming up, you probably wouldn't be going to sign up. Because the call is not one to, sometimes less than wonderful. And these disciples experienced that firsthand. But they were called. Jesus approached them and called them. They were not volunteers. When you look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John's Gospel as well, you'll find that they were not volunteers. Jesus came to them. And that is the core behind the doctrine of election. And so I'm going to read a couple of verses to us that I think are really explain it in a very clear way. And let me go to John's Gospel, chapter 6, verse 44. Jesus said, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. No one can come to me." So that's quite clear, and there's other verses in that chapter we could look to, but I will just keep it to that. And then I'm going to go to Romans chapter 8 and verse 30. Romans 8, Paul's letter. And he writes to the Roman church, and those whom he predestined, he also called, and those whom he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. So there it is, predestined. I don't care if we like the idea of it or not. It's pretty hard to get away from. Let me say this. I didn't realize it at first, how difficult it was going to be. You can't get away from it. It's just too there. He called. Those who predestined before the foundation of the world, then he called to himself, began to reveal himself. And then those whom he called, he justified. That is the word that would mean conversion, regeneration, the new birth. And those who were converted, were justified, were indwelt by the Holy Spirit. That's what it means to be glorified. Where God's Spirit is, there's God's glory. So glorified is the indwelling of the individual by the Holy Spirit. Really simple. Simple stuff. But it took me 29 years to get that because I was prejudiced against the whole idea. Isn't that strange? How something can be right smack dab in front of me. That old word my dad used to say, smack dab. Anybody say that word anymore? Probably not. But I still do. Anyway, so there it is, the call. So we have verse 16. Passing alongside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, the brother of Simon, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen. Okay. So there they are. He's not far from his hometown of Nazareth, and he's gone down to Galilee, which probably was a resort area. The winds cooled things down. It was fresh water, stocked full of fish. It was very, very nice, and it still is today. And so he went along there, and he found Simon and Andrew. Now, he just didn't find them. He actually had met them before. That's the interesting part. He had met them before. And we'll take just a quick look. That story is found in John, first chapter. Let's see if my eyes can find it. And I'm reading from a part of John's Gospel that is titled, Jesus Calls the First Disciples. It's similar to what we have in Mark. And I think I'm just going to take a look, read this a little bit. The next day, again, John was standing with two of his disciples. He looked at Jesus as he walked by and said, "Behold the Lamb of God." The two disciples heard him say this, and they followed Jesus. Jesus turned and saw them following and said to them, "What are you seeking?" And they said to him, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and you will see." So they came and saw where he was staying, and they stayed with him that day, for it was about the 10th hour. One of the two who heard John speak, and follow Jesus was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. He first found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which means Christ. John is writing to largely a Gentile audience, so he explains the Jewish words. He brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, you are Simon, the son of John." In other words, you probably heard about this guy. "You shall be called Cephas, which means Peter, which means a little rock. Rocky. You might say Jesus gave him a nickname of Rocky. So my point is that Jesus had encountered these guys before. They had spent some time with him. They'd eaten with him. They were staying overnight. Probably, I guess, that figures in. But the point is, he knew them. They were introduced to him. But he did not call them at that point. That's the interesting thing. that I want to be careful to bring out. I like to say that sometimes we have brushes with God. We have certain things happen in our lives that make us wonder, what was that? How come I survived? How was it that I escaped? How is it that I've understood these things? These things that I've experienced, what's that all about? Brushes with God, chance occurrences, odd events taking place. And I think that some of these can be a brush with God. Not exactly like what Simon and Peter and Andrew had down there where John was baptizing, but equivalent in a way. That would be apropos for our culture, our times. A little brush with God. It's funny, maybe when you're little, maybe a teenager, maybe older, but something happens. And it's as though it was a God event. Anyway, so these brushes that we have with God. So we saw Simon and Andrew. They were brothers. They were casting a net into the sea. Now this would have been casting a particular kind of net, a big net that had weights along the outside, and it would take two of them and they'd throw it out. That's how I figure it. It seems to me I've seen some Hollywood film to that effect. And they were trying to catch fish. That's what that was all about. That's the way they earned their living. And some of the finest fish were in the Sea of Galilee. I read about that not too long. No, I saw a documentary on it and talked about some of the fish and how they were cured and smoked and salted and put into various kinds of liquids, I think. I think maybe vinegar and so on, and how they were kind of pickled and so on. This was a good business they were doing. So here these two guys are. We don't know exactly how old they were. I'm going to guess. This is one of those Philpott guesses. I'm going to guess that they were someplace in their middle 20s, I think. About their middle 20s. Putting this at about the year 30, we know it was some 33 years later that Peter was martyred in Rome in his then mid to late 60s, about something of that nature. So that's probably how it is. We don't know which is the older brother. I would guess that Andrew was the older brother. Verse 17, and Jesus said to them, follow me. Follow me. When I was doing ministry in the Haight-Ashbury in the late 60s, the hippies didn't think much of Christians. Christians already had a bad name. And so instead of saying that I was a Christian, I would say, I'm a follower of Jesus. And that worked. People didn't give me much trouble with that one. They would have if I said, well, I'm a Christian. They would have dismissed me much more quickly. But I said, I am a follower of Jesus. I got it from this. Follow me. We follow Jesus. Christian means that we follow Jesus, that we try to be like Jesus. That's what that's about. Muslims try to be like Muhammad, down to the beard, particular look of the beard, the dress, eating with the right hand, on and on and on, having at least 4 wives, doing what Muhammad did, expanding Islam with the sword if you can't do it by diplomacy, to be like Muhammad. We have a desire to be like Jesus. It's the counterpart, isn't it? And Jesus says, I am meek and lowly in heart. Jesus says, love your enemies, and so on. And that's attractive. I really don't want to have to go on the lesser jihad and be fighting those people that disagree with me. And Jesus said, follow me, and I will make you become fishers of men. Make you become fishers of men. And notice the words, make you become fishers of men. It is more the idea, I'm going to teach you how to do this. It's a process. It's going to be extended into the future. It starts here, and it's going to continue. I'm not going to go like that, and zoom, you've got it. You're not going to graduate with some degree, or you're going to spend 3 years with me, and you're going to get ordained or shazammed or whatever, and you've got it. It's discipleship and following Jesus is a lifelong event. It never stops. You never stop learning. You never stop growing. Never. Ever. It just continues on and on. And that's one of the exciting things about being a Christian. And it is in the following, the great adventure. See, that's the great adventure. One of my jobs as a pastor is to get as many people as possible engaged in ministry. That's what I see as my primary ministry next to the proclamation of the gospel, is to equip the saints for the work of ministry. I love to see people get out there and get doing stuff, following Jesus, doing the work, working in the vineyard in some capacity or another. And there's so many ways to do that, but that is a big part of it. So it is a process of making a person become a fisher. Now, he uses a symbol here, doesn't he? Those people who think that it has to be literal, we're going to run into problems with that. We're not sitting around throwing nets into the water. We are not sitting around baiting hooks and casting them out and dragging it down Market Street or around 4th Street or down Miller Avenue or Grant Street or wherever you happen to be, or Bridgeway. We're not doing that. We're not baiting hooks and throwing it out into the traffic up down Highway 101. No, we are proclaimers of the gospel. There's a perfect instance to show the metaphor and the analogous language that's used all throughout Scripture. So don't let anyone put anything over on you about how it's got to be literal. Anyway, I get frustrated when I think about that. Anyway, follow me, I'll make you become fishers of men. In other words, you're going to, with the gospel message, you're going to bring people to me. That what you're doing is going to draw people to Jesus himself. And too often it's to the individual, it's to the organization, it's to the denomination, it's to the church. Too often that's the case. That preachers set up their own little kingdoms. And we have plenty of evidence of that sort of thing. And it always ends tragically. We bring people to Jesus that become fishers of men. Follow me. Follow me is always the message that comes to us. Verse 18, and immediately they left their nets and followed him. Here is a radical event that takes place. This is radical. No place do we find that they consulted their families about it. I have to be careful here because of the misuse of this. But they didn't consult their families, their boss, other people. They just followed him. Back in the Jesus People movement, there was a group called the Children of God. And what they said was, you must leave the middle class. You must be a radical follower of Jesus, and you just go. You cut off ties with everybody. That's the end of it. It was a disastrous cult. Huge cult, the Children of God, founded by David Berg, called David Moses Berg, and the Children of God out of Huntington Beach down in Los Angeles. What a disaster. It is still going after all this time. Awful. And it preached this really, really radical message that was attractive to many of the hippie kids who they didn't have any families anyway, or they'd kissed them all goodbye a long time ago. And they weren't interested in working or going to school. They were on the road. They're going to be radical, and they found the perfect venue for doing that. And there have been many other groups. To be a radical follower of Jesus, to be a pure and real, biblically traditional follower of Jesus, is not to become a religious nut. Some kind of mindless fanatic caught up in some crazy group with some far out, seemingly sold out for Jesus leader. Not that. I've seen all that. It's all dangerous. The commitment is a personal one to Jesus to be his followers. It may be a meek and mild little ministry. It may be visiting the homeless. It may be any number of things. It may be feeding people. It may be, who knows what it might be. It doesn't matter. It may be being a straightforward preacher of the gospel like myself. It may be a missionary in a foreign land. It may not be. Who knows? It can be any of thousands and thousands of kinds of things. Christians are engaged in so much stuff. But it is a follower of Jesus. Jesus is in front of you and you're following Jesus. And I think, and like many of us do, that Christianity today has become very lukewarm, has become very pedestrian, very comfortable. And we don't see the kinds of desires to be a follower of Jesus as we did in the Jesus movement. But then again, that was an outpouring of the Spirit of God. And you're not going to see so much of that. We live in normal times. But whatever times, if we live in times that are anointed by the Spirit or not, we still are called to be followers of Jesus. It means to be like him, to grow up into him, to learn from him, to obey him. It's a big deal. Verse 19. And going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John his brother, who were in their boat mending the nets. Okay, here we go. We got James and John. This James would become the first martyr in the church, as a matter of fact. First one who was killed. First one to die for Christ. The last name was Zebedee. They were brothers. Because James is named first, I'm going to guess that he was the older. And they were in their boat mending their nets. Here's the Sea of Galilee. There they were. They probably knew Peter and Andrew. I think most commentators are reasonably assured that they would have at least been acquainted, if not good friends. It's interesting how Jesus picked his disciples. Family members, relatives, people that were friends, sets of brothers, and it provided a cohesiveness already. So that's what he did. And they were in their boat. Now, they were sitting out a little bit, and they were sitting in the boat, pretty good-sized boat, and they were fixing the nets. I know that's what a lot of fishermen did during the day. A lot of the fishing was early in the morning, in the evening, and at night. And so they're doing that, and it says in verse 20, and immediately, there's John's verse again, and immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with the hired servants and followed him. Wow. What are you going to do with that? Now, was that impolite? Was that something that ought not to have been done? Really kind of hard to know. I've looked at this many times. I've wondered, were James and John disobedient to the Father? Did they ask permission? Doesn't seem that they did. There's no indication that they asked permission. Maybe it was that Father Zebedee knew it was time for them to go and it was okay. They didn't leave him bereft because there were the hired servants, and I think that may be what Mark is trying to tell us here, that it was not going to put Father Zebedee out of business, but they left and they followed him. That's a very interesting kind of thing. It is something that kind of is astonishing in our own day. In Luke 5:10, we find Jesus saying this to James and John. We don't find it in Mark. We find it in Luke chapter 5, verse 10. It says, "Do not be afraid. From now on, you will be catching men." I'm not sure that Luke 5:10 that's directed to James and John, but he says it to them and to all. Do not be afraid. Perhaps there was a larger discussion that went off on. We find over and over again, we find some of the conversations that Jesus had with people in Mark boiled down to a very few words. In Matthew and Luke, it's expanded. And in John's Gospel sometimes too. You find more there, more transpired. You just get the kernel with Mark a lot of times. And I think this is one of those instances. I think there was more conversation with Peter and Andrew. I think there was more conversation with James and John. So we're not exactly so. And what you see on your screen is very important. Matthew 13:47. "Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that was thrown into the sea and gathered fish of every kind." And we throw out the net. Christians throw out the net. That's what I'm essentially doing here. I'm throwing out a net. That's what I've done all of my ministry, throwing out a net. And you never know what kind of fish are going to be found in there. There are a wide variety of fish. But God is the one who catches them. And that's why I started this program talking about election and calling. We don't determine that. The Christian job is to broadcast, proclaim, bear witness, and God will save those whom He calls to Himself. Those whom God has chosen, God has elect, they will come to Him. Our job is to simply present the message. That's what we do. That's all we do. We don't have to be skilled at it. We don't have to be slick, tricky, professional, polished. That has little to do with anything. So, we see the call. And I have to say, I became a Christian in 1963. I was going to be a school psychologist. I left it to go to seminary, and I'm not unhappy that I did this. I have had my difficult times, my ups and downs, but I have never regretted being a Christian, a follower of Jesus, and called into His work. It has been a pleasure. So long.